Hopefully you have already seen the video, the quick one that I produced just on the steps that you would use for consumer and producer surplus. This is the slide that I used to create that, and you can also find it in Blackboard in the consumer and producer surplus folder. So now let's go ahead and take a look quickly at a problem. So here I have the weekly quantity demanded X in hundreds of the game WW7 is related to the unit price P in dollars by. So here I've given you the demand function where X again is that quantity in hundreds. And then the next thing that I give you is the supply function. And I've asked you here to find three things: the market equilibrium, then compute the consumer surplus at the equilibrium point, and then compute the producer surplus at the equilibrium point. So let's jump right in with market equilibrium. Market equilibrium is something that we studied in the very first unit, and you also studied it in classes obviously before calculus. But here I've just set up several columns. My first column, I've set up a reasonable demand. And because X is the demand in hundreds, and so is X is the supply supply in hundreds as well, I just went from 0 to 15 there, where 1 would represent 100 and 15 would represent 1500. Next thing I did was I went ahead and typed in my supply equation, dragged that down. In the next column, I typed in my demand equation, drag that down, and then remember when we're working with supply, demand, and we're looking for market equilibrium, there's a difference that you set up, and it's the difference between supply and demand, so that's just a very simple function. The next thing that I did was I noticed that I've got something going on here between -3 and +2.2, which means it would certainly go across 0. So I went ahead and goal seek, and if you remember how to goal seek, it is simply data, what if, goal seek, and remember how that's done. You're goal seeking to 0, and what you're going to change is the input value or the X value. And you can see there we went through that process again. With these values, this X value that we get for quantity, and then these two pretty much exactly the same values that we get for supply and demand, are so important now in finding the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. The very first thing that we do is we're going to be looking at what we call the area of the rectangle. And if you remember in the diagram that I included in that overview video, there is clearly this rectangle that is formed, and it's formed when we take the X value at market equilibrium and we multiply it by that price value, or that the Y value, so to speak, in the market equilibrium. So going back to our problem, this value of 199.873 simply comes from multiplying the value that I got for X at market equilibrium with that Y value, either from the supply function or the demand function. So that area of the rectangle is very important. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how we would use that value to find the consumer surplus. We know that with consumer surplus, we're going to always anti-differentiate from 0 to the X value that we obtained at market equilibrium. So 5.591 is going to be the upper limit of my anti-derivative, and 0 is going to be the lower limit. Think about that fundamental theorem of calculus. You can see that I'm setting up the 5 cell right here. The next thing that I did, this one I really didn't have to do on paper because it was a simple polynomial. I just took my demand function and I simply anti-differentiated. So I cubed it, divided by 3, and then I had 42, which was a constant that needed a variable. So I did all of that in one step. That gave me this value of 223.171. I dragged that down, and then here, this is just a simple step in fundamental theorem of calculus where I basically subtract. Well, if you're doing consumer surplus correctly, what happens is the value that you get when you use fundamental theorem of calculus is larger than the area of the rectangle. That should tell you how you subtract. And in fact, I did. I took the value that I got for consumer, once I took the antiderivative from 0 to 5.9, that FTC value is greater than the area of the rectangle. I just subtract. That gives me a value for my consumer surplus as 23.2977. That is the value that I was looking for in Part B. So you might want to pause the video here before I go on and see if you can do the producers based on the notes I've already given you. And you know that I'm going to do it here in just a second. Okay, so for producer surplus, what we need to do here is we're going to go through the same idea. 0 is the lower limit, 5.591 is the upper limit. Here, I simply took the antiderivative of my supply function. You can see that I've just raised it, divided, done the things that I needed there. And this value, 158.524, is less than the value of the rectangle. So that should give you an idea of how we're going to subtract. Here you can see that where we subtracted, we did take the area of the rectangle now and subtracted that 158.524. And that is the value that we get as we calculate or compute the producer surplus. I'd love for you to take those two values and really discuss what the meaning is. You can go back to the overview, and in the overview you can see that we can interpret the consumer surplus value as the money saved by the consumers when the product is sold at the market equilibrium price. So that value that we just got represents a value of money that was saved. And the same thing with producer surplus. It's the money that was saved by the producer, or extra profit, so to speak. But try to go through this again. There's plenty of examples in your lab manual, and I hope that you were able to go through those. Please let me know if I can help further with these questions.